as we promised that we would. Good afternoon. I wish to honor and acknowledge the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware Indigenous people on whose ancestral homelands we now gather. I want to thank the Prindle Institute for Ethics, the Peeler Art Center, and especially the brave Maggie Leninger for the invitation to come speak with you today. Before I begin, I'm going to warn you that this presentation contains challenging imagery of racist and fascist symbols, gun worship, and sexual assault that may be triggering to some individuals. As my husband is fond of saying, there is something here to offend just about everyone. I find that in the zeitgeist of the current attention economy, where celebrities will do just about anything to stay relevant, there is a lot of cynicism surrounding artists' motivations for creating potentially controversial art. In a country that rarely values humanities-based education and virtually everyone prioritizes chasing money, the artist is often misunderstood. Because of the work I will show you today, I've had people accuse me of being paid by some organization to create it, as if I was an artist for hire. I can't answer for other artists, but I make this work because since childhood, I've been compulsively driven to tell the truth, especially when people have made an effort to subvert it. This is no accident. My father trained as a priest, but left the seminary when he had dreams of his future children. Despite frequently holding down 2 jobs, he saw parenthood as a vocation. He would leave out our favorite candy bars on the dining room table for weeks at a time, teaching us how to resist temptation. Our family had endless dinner conversations debating the morality of real-life scenarios. Our favorite game was Scruples. Curiously, we never discussed politics. So I view all political issues through the lens of ethics, compassionate morality through critical thinking, rather than religious morality dictated through rigid, unquestioning doctrine. My siblings and I grew up with holes in our shoes and were often hungry, yet my dad somehow managed to send us to Catholic schools and take us to live in France for a year on his sabbatical from teaching high school French and Latin. It changed our lives. Despite limited resources, he had carefully considered convictions about his priorities and did what was necessary to realize them. His primary educational tools were literature and film. We were surrounded by books and went to the library every Tuesday night for a fresh supply. Our family's greatest pleasure was watching movies together, followed by intense topical discussions. The unforgettably persuasive messages of his carefully curated films were unwavering integrity, unapologetic individualism, a moral imperative to fight injustice, and a sometimes pathological perseverance despite any and all obstacles. My early work revealed truths about myself, and later it evolved to address the outside world. What has been consistent from the very beginning is the internal conflict resulting from my attempt to reconcile the way I think the world is supposed to be versus how it truly is. I am far from a saint myself. I simply find that with all that is happening in the world, I can only sleep at night when I know that I am doing something to make it better. I believe that artists hold tremendous power. Evocative art enters your nervous system to touch parts of you that rhetoric cannot. A charged, layered object can haunt viewers for days as their subconscious works to unpack it. A single work of art might not change the world, but it provokes, nudges the conversation along, and ultimately advances civilization. Artists can do this because while others chase wealth, comfort, and stability, the artist's highest priority is to be free. Society counts on us to stand up and tell difficult truths, as many of them cannot, because they have jobs they're not willing to risk, families they don't want to embarrass, or they don't want to stand out, jeopardize sales, or risk being wrong. I believe that many creatives are born with extrasensory receptors. This sensitivity often allows them to hold their ear to the ground and feel what is coming, even when the rumble is miles away. Instinctually, they yell out a warning, like that first animal in the forest, alerting everyone within earshot that something is coming. Whether others are listening or not at that moment is irrelevant. The artists are simply doing what they do. For many, creating is the way that they process and make sense of the world. I'm unusually sensitive to light, sound, the emotions and energies of those around me, and other people's pain that I see in the news. I work obsessively, sometimes forgetting to take breaks, and often end up injuring my body. I find it difficult to resist calling out the elephant in any given room, especially if it involves an injustice. I don't consider this a pathology, but a voice that is needed to steer our distracted, inertia-driven, neurotypical society back on course. I chose this vocation because it became apparent to me that it was the one activity where I could maintain my own impossible standards without compromise. It is a way to remain pure, at least in one's work. Picasso once said, "Art is a lie about the truth." Unlike journalists, artists have no rules about sources or what we can or cannot say without proof. If we were bound by those kinds of directives, we couldn't work our magic. We're listening to our intuition. We're channeling, not reporting. We often take a chance, tell our highest truth as we perceive it, and then it's up to our audience to decide if it has value. That feral shriek we put out into the wilderness might be ignored, or it might save the day if others deem the message worthy and pass it along, like a chain reaction for miles. But we've done our job, and the cry we created now has a life of its own. For example, in 2018, I bought a bunch of counterfeit mega hats to rip them up. By early 2019, I made this armband with the pieces. When I shared it on social media, I was called out, even by some artist friends, for comparing what was happening in our country at that moment to the horror of the Holocaust. They were reading it literally, an affliction of our increasingly left-brain culture. Some called it an exaggeration or claimed it was disrespectful to all the people who died under Nazi reign. But through research, I saw what was coming down the pipe years ago and knew where we were headed. What I made was not simply a flippant, provocative gesture, but the firing of a warning flare into the air. I replied to the critics, "Do you think the rise of fascism began with concentration camps?" No, it began with the progressive insistence over the course of years that one group of human beings was superior to another. And I believe that if all those survivors and victims of the Holocaust were alive today, they would recognize what's happening here, and they would want us to do everything that we possibly could to stop it. The reality of this moment has made me impatient with subtle art that merely grazes these issues. I believe it is a time for art to scream. Becoming a mother and thinking about the world my especially vulnerable daughter will have to navigate has turned up the volume in my work. I am screaming at the top of my lungs in the only way I know how. When many Trump supporters subsequently embraced this symbol, no one told me I was exaggerating anymore. Although I no longer practice, I was raised on a visual regimen of Catholicism and Technicolor films. Both influences contain palettes of lurid colors, dramatic light, and a highly defined code of morality. Most significantly, they contain an almost palpable air of repression and a tacit understanding that there are certain truths we dare not utter. I became obsessed at an early age with calling out those truths through decades of disparate subject matter and dramatic shifts in media. In my early career, I painted night environments because people are more authentic at 2 a.m. than they are at midday. Then I realized that I did not want to hide behind a narrative any longer, striving instead for radical vulnerability. I told the truth about my family's dysfunctionalities. I told the truth about my own bad choices. Then I wanted to go deeper, to get inside. So I taught myself how to work in textiles. Doing a series of clothing that revealed hidden psychological states rather than concealing them, inverting the notion of clothing as idealized packaging. I made embroidered drawings with my own hair, revealing my dreams and nightmares. When my boyfriend cut off his hair and gave it to me in a box because he thought I loved his hair more than him, I worked it into a piece, inventing a tool to thread the hair through the pillow. So for 20 years, I told truths about my own interior life. In 2006, out of nowhere, I had an overwhelming urge to make an assumption painting, despite the fact that I'd never done anything like it before. I stopped and started the research several times over the course of 6 months, trying to figure out how this inexplicable desire to do a painting with clouds, flowing robes, heaven, earth, and putti was supposed to manifest itself and yet be relevant to the current day. The missing piece came to me while standing in a checkout line. Every tabloid featured Angelina Jolie with a child. I embraced the kitsch, positioning her over a Walmart. Although aspects of this painting now make me cringe, it apparently struck a chord and appeared in every major newspaper in the world before the Art Miami Fair even opened. I got my first threats from enraged Christians, and we put an alarm in our house. The coverage I got for the painting, however, was mostly of the vulgar pop culture variety, ironically, the very system I was trying to critique. After years of personal work, I'd listened to the voice telling me to look to the outside world, but I wasn't thrilled with the kind of attention the piece got. And I ultimately rolled up and put away the next similar painting in progress forever, rather than capitalizing on the success, churning out a bunch more, and hiring a publicist, as many suggested I do. The Blessed Art Thou painting had brought lots of non-art people to Art Miami. So my gallery promised that I would get a prominent display spot at the fair the following year. Usually pieces are chosen for fairs after they are completed. So this is a rare opportunity, and it seemed to me that the only thing that I could possibly do would be to make a painting about art fairs and the role of artists in the contemporary art world. I spent 9 months creating Requiem for Vassily and the Ineffable. This painting was made at the height of the art market boom, when many newly rich collectors were buying art not because they loved it, but for status, investment, and money laundering. An art fair atmosphere resembles a shopping mall or a sports stadium bathed in buzzing green light, where the magic, impact, and context of individual work is lost. It becomes just another commodity. The triangular canvas references Vassily Kandinsky's theory of the pyramid, where the artist is visionary at the top of the triangle, leading the rest of civilization behind him. I inverted the triangle to represent the contemporary art market's disempowerment of the artist, who is shown at the bottom alone in the studio. And this is an in progress shot. Even if a masterpiece was created, it would become just another object in a sea of objects at the VIP party for the wealthy that is the art fair. I did research and took great pains to make the designer fashions and handbags up to the minute in style, in hopes that some VIPs would stand in front of the work and see themselves in the painting. In Catholicism, relics are treasured objects that remain as evidence of martyrdom or sacred events. At the height of the art market frenzy, in response to millionaire artists who don't make their own work, I decided to celebrate the workers' garments that I wear. They mark the many months spent personally creating my large, time-consuming paintings. I invest even more time into these relics by embroidering them with observations about the art world to create the Art World Truths series. And these were the overalls I mostly wore to paint this painting, so I wore them to Art Miami that year. I went back to making interior work for 6 years about motherhood, about the unique combination of sexism and ageism that women in our culture experience. Yet I couldn't get away from the social commentary work that seemed determined to chase me down. I have learned to trust these voices, and I surrender to them completely. One of the most accurate descriptions of this process was penned by philosopher Martin Buber. This is the eternal origin of art, that a human being confronts a form that wants to become a work through him, not a figment of his soul, but something that appears to the soul and demands the soul's creative power. What is required is a deed that a man does with his whole being. If he commits it, then the creative power is released and the work comes into being. And the work is imperious. If I do not serve it properly, it breaks or it breaks me. The form that confronts me, I cannot experience nor describe. I can only actualize it. So this is how my series Bully Culture came to be. I was in the perfect position to channel this work. I no longer cared about what people thought of me, not even art world people. I was free to look around me and make the art that needed to be made, to process and try to make sense of this insane world I was living in, to do everything I could to make it better for my daughter. The series has consumed me with an unusual intensity for the past 10 years. It foreshadowed not only the Me Too movement, but the 2016 election and the ugly aftermath of emboldened racism. I was driven by a force that seemed beyond my control. It was very clear to me what I had to do. I'd been researching the topics for 3 or 4 years before the making even began. I felt the unprecedented need to maintain a bibliography. currently at hundreds of references. The series evolved into a type of thesis with a continuous ongoing dialogue between research and creation. The work was pouring out of me. I quizzed my friends on Facebook asking, have you ever seen art that was too intense? I had lots of studio visits because I felt like I was jumping off some kind of creative cliff into the unknown. It was as if a meteor had crashed into my creative space. Friends would come over to check out this curious new work, and we would both stare at it together, trying to make sense of it, to figure out where it came from. Some acquaintances were clearly scared and put off. I showed some images during a mutual share session with 20 fellow fiber artists, and people literally clapped after every presentation but mine. I don't even think they realized it. I had a solo show in 2018 at York College in Pennsylvania. The opening was packed, but uncharacteristically and unnervingly silent. I was crawling out of my skin with discomfort. Yet after people had time to process the work, everyone wanted to talk about it. The impetus for this series came from all the world problems that keep me awake at night. I felt certain that there was a common denominator to all of these crimes against children, women, people of color, the poor, animals, and the earth. So I began to research them all simultaneously. A few years of study revealed that there are many overlaps when it comes to problems we traditionally address as separate issues. I realized that we define and classify social injustices with a focus on the victims. Racism, violence against women, animal abuse, environmental destruction, poverty. These overlaps came up time and time again. Sociologists and psychologists finding links between abuse of animals, children, elders, and women. Links between domestic abuse and mass shooters. Links between racism and gun culture. Between racism and sexism. While each of these researchers were focused on connections between only a few types of crimes, I stepped back and saw that essentially across all of these injustices, the perpetrators were often the same. So my newest series is entitled #Bully Culture. The hashtag envelops and labels all these disparate actions in our culture that we've been steeped in for so long that we might not recognize them as part of the same problem. And like rape culture, there are greater and lesser degrees to these behaviors. Some of them are deemed socially acceptable, even as they lay the groundwork for and provide slippery slopes into more monstrous behavior. My use of the word bully deliberately circumvents the agenda-driven, inaccurate readings of Darwin that have been repeatedly ingrained into our culture to justify aggression. Bully reminds us that behavior is a personal choice. We've always had both good and evil in the world, but cultures can emphasize, reward, and reinforce either the more selfish, brutalistic aspects or the more communal, altruistic aspects of our humanity. The US was literally built on violence, from the land theft and slaughter of Native Americans, not that different from what is happening in Ukraine right now, to the slaves we captured and ripped away from their homeland. Today, like a cancer, US corporations colonize poorer countries, exploit their resources, and utilize their people as slave labor. They destroy the planet we need to sustain all living things. Then their lawyers, intimidators armed with paper that might as well be clubs, silence by any means necessary those who protest their company's heinous crimes. Parents claim to reject playground bullies while simultaneously tuned in to the aggressive, ugly Housewives of reality show, or the football game where huge swaths of players not only sustain injuries for our entertainment, but are forgiven rapes and violence against women and animals as long as they win. We teach our kids to intimidate and annihilate on the soccer field, preparing them for lives in the corporate sphere. A growing lack of empathy, often bordering on sadism, permeates our spectacles of ruthless competition. We love the journalistic takedown piece exposing celebrity imperfection and the voyeurism of peeking through the keyhole at desperate, often mentally ill others. Everything we do in our culture is framed as a battle with winners and losers. Following a debate where Trump demonstrated unhinged abusive behavior of both opponent and host with 73 interruptions and egregious disregard for civil democratic debate rules, Fox News simply shrugged it off as Trump's an alpha, Biden's a beta. This shallow dichotomy was amplified by our former commander-in-chief, who parlayed his true talents for brutish arrogance, posturing, and self-serving aggression into a crass self-branding as the ultimate winner, albeit a label as thin as the gold leaf lining his branded properties. Through his TV show, US citizens became desensitized to his cruelty. Following typical psychological symptoms of celebrity worship, they felt like they knew him because he came into their living rooms each week. And so without doing their homework as diligent voting citizens, they made him our president. Through classic identification with the aggressor, many of our countries aggrieved and disempowered aligned themselves with the bully for protection. He created common enemies and encouraged followers to punch down at anyone they could find to make themselves feel like they're not on the bottom rung. This compulsive liar told them that anyone who did not agree with him was fake. And they suddenly did an about face on the news sources that they had trusted their entire lives. Something in our collective humanity broke in 2016. The collective despair that enveloped our country, and I dare say the world, was not just the result of one political party defeating another. It was the collapse of the oldest, most deeply ingrained childhood tale. The one that allows all of us to sleep peacefully at night, the one that gives us the optimism to have babies and to tell those babies as well as ourselves that everything will be all right. This narrative was utterly destroyed because the bully had won. I use art to exercise things I find unbearable in my own life, in the lives of others I meet, and in the world at large. Stories of cruelty and injustice enter my body in a violent, visceral way. Once something has pierced my consciousness, I turn it around in my mind for days, weeks, or even years, looking for a way to transform it, to extricate it from my body in a way that will get others to look, feel, and think about the absurd and problematic world that we live in. My job is to create the most potent object possible, to seduce viewers into confronting aspects of the world they don't want to think about. Some pieces take years. The tremendous amount of time invested in my pieces is cathectic, a type of meditative healing practice akin to prayers, incantations, or sutras, simultaneously discharging my pain while infusing the object with transformative energy. This piece, The Final Word, was a segue to bully culture. When I thought it was completely finished, I ended up spending another 9 hours on this half-inch area of the face to get it just right. So I thought it was important to begin the bully culture series by examining the ways in which I am complicit in subjugating other beings. I titled the first wave of this work, The Cognitive Dissonance Pieces, and addressed the assumption that we have the right to treat animals as inert commodities rather than sentient beings. In psychology, cognitive dissonance is the mental stress experienced by an individual who holds two contradictory beliefs or values at the same time, such as loving animals like pets in one context, but also eating them, wearing them, making them work, performing painful experiments on them, holding them captive, and killing them at will. Love Object for a Future Trophy Hunter is about the liminal state between children's instinctive identification with and need to protect animals, and later feeling entitled to eat, wear, and even hunt them for the thrill. On a larger scale, this piece embodies my confusion about the transition that humans make in many areas. While our empathy for others is innate, we're born with it, somewhere along the way, it transforms into objectification, which becomes an excuse for exploitation and abuse. It is time to examine and eradicate the methods being employed to squash empathy in our children. This untitled piece is an earlier work that connects to this series with a process that I would later revisit in the flag that's now hanging in the gallery. I took apart a cloth flag, ripped out parts of the embroidered stars, and re-embroidered them. The center is padded like a real Band-Aid. The Gun Lickers subseries is about the fetishization of guns, particularly the ones that are not tools for hunting dinner or protecting your family from an intruder, but machines created for military use, specifically designed to kill as many people as possible in the shortest period of time. Scientific research has proven that the chemical secreted when firing a gun is the same one we secrete when kissing someone. In my paintings, the weapons are small in scale, so they can grow as love and attention is lavished upon them. These images were inspired by gun rights extremists who fetishize, collect, and wield people-killing machines as a cheap intimidation tactic in the guise of fashion accessory. Traditionally, the casting of minorities, women, the poor, and even animals as other has always been the first step in rationalizing violence against them. So these paintings invert this paradigm, employing abject cues, details such as nose hair, dirty fingernails, drool, etc., not just as tools of satire, but as an attempt to turn the tables and present aggressors as foreign, strange, other. For me, aggressors represent perverted aberrations in an otherwise civilized society and need to be treated as such. My first gun licker painting was featured in a Huffington Post article that made me and my daughter the target of gun activist harassment and threats. Curiously, a good friend, one who supported my work for decades, accused me of asking for it by making the paintings, causing me to ponder whether anyone ever told male artists who created the atrocities of war or Guernica that they were, quote unquote, asking for it. When I receive threats like these, I think, don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger. When people get upset by the intensity of my work, it honestly puzzles me. I want to ask them, why aren't you angry at the actual injustices that made the creation of this work a necessity? One Day in America is made from a beautiful cross stitch that I purchased from a nice lady in Missouri. I added the gun, sewed it onto a piece of blue velvet, and added 96 stars and beads, one for each person who dies from gun-related incidents in the US each day. Tragically, the number of daily deaths continues to rise each year since I made this piece. Storm depicts the pregnant moment just before another US gun massacre. The silhouette in the doorway begs the question people in open carry states are now forced to ask, is that a good guy with a gun or a bad guy with a gun? In some earlier work, I rendered parts of my imagery upside down to suggest the suspension of time. Here, the inverted tornado is about to strike a house. The second that it does, everything changes. The embroidery technique at the bottom is meant to create psychological noise, to render the air electric and charged at the moment before everyone's lives are irreparably damaged forever.
Look.
Cri de coeur, or heart cry, is my depiction of what it feels like to be a parent trying to keep your child safe in 21st century America. The figures are borrowed from a Joseph Desiree Court painting detail. Rupture features the crowdsourced hair of people who've recently experienced extreme loss, hand embroidered onto black fabric. Hair, like the rings of a tree, records all the extreme experiences our bodies have gone through. So the moment of transition from before to after the loss is actually embedded in the material that makes up the piece. Portrait of a Mass Shooter features the faces of 20 mass shooters superimposed on top of each other. The text reads, "Just another man with anger management issues and unfettered access to mountains of people-killing machines." And on the bottom, in parentheses, "to be continued." VIP, or very important penis, was inspired by the lengthy list of powerful men in sports, Hollywood, and politics who've been convicted of rape. An evolving online component tags the piece with the names of these prominent men, so the image eventually comes up when they're Googled. The prototype was made in 2011, long before the Me Too movement, and was finally cast in 2017. In one newspaper review of this 2018 show, readers were warned by the newspaper that the exhibition did not just contain regular nudity, but male nudity. Women's naked bodies are available everywhere for our consumption, but men are used to controlling how and when others see penises. Anyone who's ever been flashed knows that the unwanted flashing of a penis is experienced as a threat that they, quote, might use it, the same way, incidentally, that one might flash a gun. An exhibition at American universities celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Ready-Made was the impetus for Ready-Made Brass with Lock, an appropriated, mass-produced object designed to hang from the trailer hitch of large pickup trucks. It was made to be viewed from a distance, so the scale is unusual when hanging on the wall, and the paranoid implications of the lock are hilarious. Testosterone was a piece I did not consider successful until I made a pink glitter frame that took the edge off. The Lie Hole series helped me keep my sanity through 2017. I was compelled to draw our new leader's mouth, swollen with self-importance and hyper-articulated in 12 different ways, This is how I think about his orifice, disembodied from truth, from decency, from potential consequences. A moving mouth spouting. When the cameras were gone, the declarations burst forth on Twitter. The mouth would not be stopped from opining. Tools of Intimidation for Little Hands and Little Minds features tools that various types of bullies use for intimidation, including a tiny cease and desist letter from Trump's lawyers to the New York Times. The diminutive size removes a great deal of their power. As the series progressed, I became interested in creating work that juxtaposed the language and the imagery from behaviors no one seems to see as related. We accept these activities in their milder forms, yet we shun them when they occur at more extreme points on the spectrum. How is the mounting of a hunting trophy different from the body part trophies collected by serial killers who want to relive the thrill of the kill and the conquest? Why are school bullies reviled while corporate lawyer bullies are just doing their jobs? What is the difference between feeling entitled to ravage our living earth through fracking versus the rape of a person? How is sports culture related to rape culture? Why do we emphasize competition over cooperation in every aspect of our society, dividing us into winners and losers? And how did our reality TV president feel about losers? And how is that manifested in his policies and in the actions of his followers against our country's most vulnerable citizens? For the Taking compares attitudes of entitlement and conquest inherent in manipulating and taking the bodies of others. I am also trying to tease out and isolate the inherent misogyny in pornography, a conversation that we never get to have because the discourse instantly devolves into discussions of censorship. Some work, such as Trophy, 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 questions similarities of intent, in this case, regarding acquisitions. And for those of you lucky enough not to know this, the finger is an example of a trophy that serial killers collect from their victims. This piece compares the entitlement that various people feel to use the bodies of others for their purposes, be it for rape, consumption, or slavery in for-profit prisons. Although it's a bold claim to make, my research tells me that some of my imagery is art historically unprecedented. One of the major inspirations for this body of work comes from the strides we've made in our understanding of rape culture over the past few years. Traditionally, the depiction of rape has been illustrated throughout the centuries by male artists as an heroic, even romanticized pursuit. Viewed from a distance, it's similar to battle scenes and other great conquests. Because male artists didn't identify with the victims, they depicted scenarios that rarely even approached the actual horror of rape, and most of the female victims looked dismayed rather than terrified. So after all the centuries of women being presented as little more than a worthless prop in male artists' fantasies of masculine self-actualization, it is no surprise that when female artists of the 1900s were finally granted the opportunity to share their point of view, virtually all chose to create imagery that focused primarily on the victim's devastated post-assault body. It makes perfect sense that they seemed focused on revealing what it feels like to inhabit a woman's body and psyche in the isolated, numbing aftermath of rape. But my research uncovered websites where men post and watch film clips of rape scenes for entertainment, cut from their original context of mainstream porn and foreign films. To my mind, when there are audiences using sexual assault imagery for self-gratifying purposes, depicting a rape victim in a work of art becomes problematic, to say the least. I was determined to avoid that imagery. The imagery I do employ is a deliberate physical manifestation of a profound revolutionary shift happening in our culture. It's shocking to think that it's taken us thousands of years to untangle the systemic misogyny that throughout history has repeatedly blamed women for inciting rapist actions. But unbelievably, finally, we're regarding rape culture as a spectrum of behaviors and pointing our finger at the rapist rather than the victim. So the point of view in my work reflects that monumental shift. It redirects the gaze, creating an intersectional battle cry to point at perpetrators and bullies, not just in circumstances of rape, but in many areas where their aggressive actions appear on a spectrum and have been accepted as the status quo. Much of the work calls out the aggressor, employing what Bell Hooks calls the oppositional gaze. In Hooks' Black Looks, Race and Representation, she describes, quote, being punished as a child for staring, for there's those hard, intense, direct looks children would give grown-ups, looks that were seen as confrontational, as gestures of resistance, challenges to authority. She recalls being amazed the first time she read in history classes that white slave owners punished enslaved Black people for simply looking at them. She comes to the conclusion that, quote, all attempts to repress Black people's right to gaze had produced in us an overwhelming desire to look, a rebellious desire, an oppositional gaze. By courageously looking, we defiantly declared, not only will I stare, I want my look to change reality. I'm employing this oppositional gaze in my own work to continually keep our eyes fixed upon perpetrators everywhere. Suko, one of my artist heroes, said that art cannot exact change from our society until the viewer is able to align themselves with the victim. So, One for the Team is a multi-panel piece that alludes to the confluence between sports culture and rape culture. We encourage and prize the aggression of our sports heroes, but many fans seem surprised to learn that their heroes often possess companion traits of aggression towards women, children, or animals. The story of the small town football star rapist protected by a community that turns on the victim has become a tired cliche. These images are burned by hand into pieces of wood, a traditionally male craft, to reference decorative objects normally found in a rural bar, a restaurant, a man cave, or living room. I'm not trying to create a specific narrative, but rather a portrait of rape culture, depicting indoctrination, humiliation through social media, the shocking complicity of some women, team loyalty, proving manhood, a fascination with the spectacle of brutality that goes back to gladiator days, and a calling out of the perpetrators. I'm capturing the fleeting details that a victim might absorb during an assault, but also subsequent images surrounding a perpetrator who's still accepted, defended, and even praised by his community after committing a heinous act. My refusal to show the victim also allows for openness regarding their gender, reminding us that it is not only females who get raped, and that the act is not one of sex, but of dominance, violence, and degradation that is encouraged by our culture in a myriad of ways. The catalyst for my painting, The Appetites of Oligarchs, was a rape case involving a powerful world figure and a housekeeper. While the impetus for its creation was sexual entitlement, The Appetites of Oligarchs evolved into a piece with layers that also address political and financial power, as well as the military-industrial complex. The figure is standing on the world's most expensive Persian carpet ever sold at auction, with the perpetually relevant bombing, in this case Baghdad, in the background. Decade after decade, men in dire need of therapy and anger management bomb cities, and innocent people die. This large life-size painting hangs with the top of the canvas away from the wall to loom threateningly over the viewer. When we've reached a point where male sexual entitlement is finally being looked at, I find it interesting that when we do talk about feminist depictions of nude men, people always seem to want to label them erotic, even when it seems quite obvious that much of it is decidedly not so. Generally, when discussing women painting nude men in art history class, there is a sexual element, a turning the tables on the male gaze. While unconventional, a fun, sexy, saleable product is created. Painting a male nude in an unflattering light is far less common. If the art world must finally pay attention to the work of female artists, how much more convenient and entertaining it is to assume that we want to talk about desire and sex, as opposed to power and control. Lines of Men depicts various groups of males where no women are represented. As does huddle, which is a term of inclusion or exclusion, depending upon who you are and whether you're in the circle or outside it. In late 2018, I ordered my first counterfeit MAGA hats in order to destroy them. MAGA hat wearers love to coyly claim that the now iconic red symbols they sport on their heads are innocuous. I cathartically ripped these hats apart to reject this claim and then manipulate the pieces into objects that function as corrective physical manifestations of the truth, revealing their essential nature. Trump has intensified and accelerated our bully culture more than any individual in recent history. He is not only the quintessential example of his type, but put in a position of power, he normalized cruelty and brutish behavior, which activated and empowered others across the world with this tendency. The first piece was Hate Hat. I realized that this object had to exist somewhere in the world, and so I figured I might as well be the one to make it. Although dozens of KKK MAGA memes now exist, 4 years ago they did not. Several prominent Black leaders spoke out in support of the work, saying that this is exactly what they see when they spot a MAGA hat, that the hair stands up on the back of their neck. Nevertheless, I was reluctant to post it upon completion. I thought it was too straightforward and obvious. The piece got me banned from Facebook for 3 weeks. Other works were repeatedly taken down from Instagram. I wrote a piece about this censorship for Medium. Some news venues picked it up. And then some kind soul created a petition. As a result, I got my page back and an invitation to show the work in San Francisco. The gallery and I started to get threats against the work and against me. So we made the show a more secure invitation-only weekend pop-up, which occurred without incident. This is one of 2 pieces that actually uses an authentic MAGA hat. This one addresses the GOP war to control women's bodies and kill their rights to determine the course of their own lives. This is one of the cots of the Trump border orphans. The drawing on the bed you can pick up and hold in your hand. And my daughter helped me with this piece. This is what she imagined the children were dreaming of. And this one. At 11, she designed her own anti-Trump t-shirt after learning of refugee children being separated from their parents at the border. The MAGA work came about because the Trump family took a perverse pleasure in a devious, slippery methodology of trolling with symbols and slogans, employing dog whistles, and speaking in code like a mob boss who escapes justice by insinuating but never giving direct orders. 45's MO repeatedly was to push to see how much he could get away with, sometimes retracting, claiming sarcasm or joking, but never apologizing for his accidental flashes of white supremacism. That's how aggressors work to normalize bad behavior. They punch the wall near your head, tell you that it was harmless, they didn't do anything, and you're overreacting before they eventually punch your face. Since 2016, half of America has been watching this horror movie in slack-jawed disbelief, wondering who is going to save us from this obvious sociopath and what he has unleashed. Nobody else. Here, they're holding a rally at the foot of the Lakota Sacred Mountains, where they use the song Gary Owen. That's the song that Custer's troops sang while massacring Native Americans, along with Hitler's most beloved song, Ride of the Valkyries. Trump's minions follow his lead, trolling in their own way, normalizing the abnormal bit by bit. A Nazi flag here, a KKK hood there. Only a few years back, there were small occasional right to carry gatherings, but now there is a tone of intimidation to the armed militias we see with increasing frequency. Although federal law bans any activity that intimidates, threatens, or coerces voters, he told them to go to the polls and watch very carefully, wink, wink. He told them to stand by, and of course, they ultimately did. A line of men wielding people-killing machines do not allow for democratic discourse or debate, and that is the point. Intimidation of your fellow citizens is terrorism. An untrained minor illegally carried a semi-automatic weapon across state lines, killed peaceful protesters, walked away free, and Republicans made him a hero. When he was on trial, his judge told prosecutors it was forbidden to label his dead victims as victims. Trump supporters planned the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a female governor who opposed him. This is Trump's America. This is MAGA, and it has not gone away. I rip up hats because I reject this new normal and all of the abusive gaslighting that goes along with it. It's just a hat, they say with a smile. No, I respond. I see what it is, and now everyone else will too. When we went into lockdown in March, I saw that once again, the most vulnerable US citizens were being sacrificed as collateral damage. And I had to embody this injustice, make it concrete. So I made a mask. Social murder is a term coined by Friedrich Engels in 1845, describing a situation where the class which holds social and political control places citizens in a position where they inevitably meet a too early and unnatural death. When people you care about are in peril, you impulsively rush to save them without thinking. Although Trump put his hand on a Bible and swore an oath to protect 330 million American citizens, his instinctive response was not one of love for his people, but a move to protect his own power. Other countries shut down for the common good to preserve as many lives as possible. Ours prioritize the economy, regarding US citizens as collateral damage. The United States instantly split into those who could afford to work from home and others who had to choose between risking their families' lives or losing their paychecks. We think of killing as something that requires action, but the 585,000 Americans who died under Trump's incompetence, deliberate denial, blatant lies, and inaction are no less dead than if he lined them all up and shot them in the middle of Fifth Avenue, as he once joked. He, along with any politician or pundit who echoed his falsehoods about the coronavirus, should be considered at the very least accomplices to manslaughter and at most guilty of crimes against humanity and should be tried as such. When I began ripping and reconstructing MAGA hats, calling out some of the uglier aspects of our history and fellow citizens, I also wanted to create something that approached this US dilemma from a more optimistic angle. Reparation, where our greatness lies, was the answer to MAGA. This is what makes our country great. It was begun in August of 2019. I ordered a 5-by-9-foot flag and proceeded to rip out all of the white machine embroidered stars to replace them with hand embroidered stars representing the melanin scale skin tones of actual US citizens. I ripped stars through 2 impeachment hearings, as well as sitting outside the White House, separated by from Trump by 3 layers of fencing. Machine embroidery is very difficult to remove. I often had to use tweezers to pull out tiny embedded individual threads and could not help but think about how this process mirrored the difficulty of completely eradicating white supremacy from the United States. This piece took about 550 hours to make. It was a labor of both love and penance. I made this work thinking that it would be my last MAGA piece, but we weren't so lucky. The work continues because the threat does. Trump still denies the legitimacy of our election. He tried to stop the peaceful transition of power to the next duly elected president. He sent his followers to overthrow democracy, watched the death, destruction, and violation of our Capitol from a safe distance on TV, and then threw those supporters under the bus when they faced legal consequences. However, he himself has not been brought to justice, and as many have pointed out, an unpunished coup attempt simply becomes a rehearsal. Trump's forte is branding. He's branded buildings, steaks, watches, wine, even a fake university. Now he's branded his own cult, one full of members he would never give the time of day to in real life, but who still seem determined to deliver our country to an authoritarian dictator. Trump employs thug tactics of name calling, demanding unquestioning loyalty, undermining perceived enemies, accusing them of doing exactly what he is doing to serve as a diversion, and repeating falsehoods until people believe him. These immoral, self-interested tactics have trickled down and seeped into politics like toxic sewage. GOP and international leaders have now adopted them, giving up any pretense of even feigning integrity. Many are armed with the intelligence and experience Trump lacks, marking them as insidious threats to humankind. Since Biden took office, so many of us have simply been relieved and recovering from exhaustion. But in a post-election Salon article, Dr. Alan D. Blotke, an associate professor of psychology, wrote, "This is not a hyperbole or melodrama. Trump and his enablers are coming at us like a runaway train, and democracy is tied to the track." I wish that I was wrong about that gut feeling 10 years ago that drove me to make this series. While some are put off by the intensity of the work, my one fear is that my cry is not loud enough, not dire enough. We are living at a pivotal moment in our history. Historians are speaking up to tell us that the current US environment is one that they've seen before, identical to governments that went on to commit some of humankind's worst atrocities. There are people working behind the scenes at a local and national level to restructure power, reframe the truth, build an army, and disempower the voting citizens of the United States. They embody bully culture, and they push the boundaries a little further every day. Malevolence relies upon our optimism, our distractibility, and our short attention spans. My work is confrontational because we need anger to fight injustice in a corrupt system. Anger is a natural response to abuse. There are two ways to live your life. One where you understand that we're all interdependent and need each other, and the every man for himself way, which, as an ever escalating paradigm of consumption and destruction, is not sustainable. The individualist bubble of consciousness, like a toddler, doesn't extend beyond his own immediate desires. Everything is here to be used for his pleasure, with little regard for whether it is built on others' pain. In contrast, when you understand that you're connected to everything and everyone, when a child is ripped from the arms of their parents or shot by a school shooter, that was your child too. You can't stop thinking about how terrified those poor children were, and you are bereft alongside those parents. You feel the horror in your own bones, and you must stop it from ever happening again. When an innocent father, mother, son, or daughter is senselessly murdered, and especially when that murderer goes free, and this happens over and over and over again, we should all feel the rage of that family that was first robbed of a loved one, then robbed of justice. Empathy is innate, but we need to take a hard look at the methods being used to condition it out of some people. Maria Montessori, the founder of Montessori schools, said, "In this world, you are educated for competition, and competition is the beginning of every war. When we educate for cooperation and offering solidarity, then we will be educating for peace." So many of the world's most ancient religions understood our connection to each other, to the creatures and the earth that we were put here to sustain and protect. The golden rule embodied in all major religions is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In effect, we are the others. As DNA tests become ubiquitous, it's likely that many people are going to discover that they're related to people that they hate. We inhale and exhale air that moved through the lungs of people on the other side of the world thousands of years ago. Again, people that we might hate. We share DNA with animals, with trees, with soil. They are our biological kin. We're all in this together. We need to join forces and persevere, because the only empowerment that bullies need to succeed is our complacency. We need to be allies for each other. The ugly human aberrations who would bully one of us will bully all of us. They are amygdala-driven humans who basically fear and aggress against anyone who is not like them. Men need to stand up for women. Caucasians need to stand up for people of color. Straights need to stand up for LGBTQ citizens. The able-bodied need to stand up for those who are not. The financially comfortable need to stand up for the exploited poor. And we all need to stand up for the voiceless animals and our living earth. What a powerful force we would be together against all perpetrators, not just the ones who pick on the group that we belong to. Our ability to recognize any bigotry and intimidation, even in its milder forms, along with our willingness to call it out and act against it, will literally determine the future course of humankind. Finally, if you are an artist in this age of capitalism run amok, understand that we are exposed to many voices relentlessly trying to convince us that we are just another type of entrepreneur, which of course means playing it safe to retain followers and likes by not offending anyone and making work that sells or fits the algorithm so it will be shared. But we really need to think twice about rebranding artists in a way that both underestimates and undermines their power. Although it's never a good time to defang artists, I would point out that it's a very dangerous moment in human history to be redirecting our prophets and visionaries, trying to convince them that they are no longer needed to keep things on track. So it's safe for them to just run off and get their piece of the pie. Writer Kurt Vonnegut famously called artists the canaries in the coal mine. Bertolt Brecht told us that art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. It's safe to say that we would not have our masterpieces by Goya, Kollwitz, Walker, and Picasso if they were concerned with marketability. Some of the most powerful businesses and governments in the world fear and silence artists exactly for this reason. But when we stand up to call out the truth, it inevitably inspires others to do the same. Bravery always begets more bravery, even if it causes some discomfort in the process. What we create has its own life in the world. The more people share it, talk about it, but also argue against it, censor it, threaten you, the more power it gains. As artist Ai Weiwei has said, the art always wins. Anything can happen to me, but the art will stay. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. I put out a Facebook call. So, you know, I've got all these women of a certain age that that sent me hair, and I was looking specifically for gray hair, and it had to be a certain length because you can't embroider with something that's this big. So that was pretty much the criteria. And one woman wrote a wonderful poem about how she used to hate to pull out her gray hairs and look in the mirror every day. And I convinced her that they were strands of silver and they were incredibly valuable. And so I was very appreciative of that. Anybody else? Yes.
Were you primarily a printer at Bing, or did you sort of switch mediums after? And how do you maneuver all of it?
I was trained as a painter. I painted and drew exclusively for many years until I taught myself how to sew certain things out of necessity. And I still don't really know how to sew like a fiber artist does. I sort of just get a vision in my head and then I just do what I need to do to make it. And I think that gives me a distinct advantage actually, because I don't know what the rules are. And so when I'm working in fiber, I just feel this kind of absolute freedom. And people invite me to give talks in their fiber departments, and then they'll tell their students, okay, now we're going to go learn how to make felts. And I always go along with them so I can learn how to make something, because I really don't know all the things that a traditional fiber person does. Anybody else? Yes.
I'm just curious about like the process of creating pieces of different mediums, like the wood carving or the wood burning. Do you usually come up with like the idea first, or is it material then?
I usually come up with something that I feel very strongly about, and I always try to choose the medium that's most potent. And I didn't know how to wood burn either. So I taught myself how to do pyrography so that I could execute those pieces. And so I just thought it was, they were perfectly matched together. And whenever possible, I do that. Yeah.
Yeah, going back to the piece, going to a certain age. So there's the hair that's embroidered around the black cloth. The embroidery depicts an object. Could you tell us about that object? I couldn't quite.
It's a silver dagger, and it's got a lot of sort of weird references. It references Louise Bourgeois' Femme Couteau, and there's also there's a country music song which I didn't even know about when I chose that dagger, which is it's a song about a silver dagger beneath someone's pillow to, it was like about females being protected from a man. And I think it was, I don't want to misquote, but I think it was somebody who was trying to protect her daughter from a suitor. And I originally, actually somebody gave me that idea. I was doing silver point drawings on actual silverware where I was gessoing the bowl, and then I would draw on silver point on them. And somebody looked at the piece and said, "Is that hair?" And I was like, oh my God, I could do silver hair, and old ladies collect silver, silverware, and it just all seemed to kind of come together. So that's sort of where the dagger came from. And I wanted to do something a bit menacing. And my idea is that about 20 women donated hair for that piece. And my idea was that, all of their cumulative experiences would be embedded in the piece. And a very good friend, longtime collector, bought the piece. And he says, he sits and looks at it and he can feel like rage emanating from the piece. But yeah, sorry, long story. Anybody else? Okay, well, I'm available for one-on-one questions, and I want to thank you all for coming and for sitting through, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, and so for those of you who get credit for this, there are sign-up sheets out at the front